Thanks so much, Karen. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here to talk about how to construct a pitch deck. We're going to go over more specific of a biotech pitch deck because they're a little different than pitching other types of technologies. Generally, if you're starting out early, you're going to go through early stage clinical trials, and you won't really have the assets or the expertise to go through a full phase clinical trial. So you're probably never going to be profitable starting out as a small biotech company. So that's where things are a little different, and that's what I'm going to go over here today. A little bit additional about me. I'm currently the CEO of a biotech company called Morphix Biotherapeutics. We're pushing an oncology asset through clinical trials. I've been involved in startup companies my entire life. I teach a class at Johns Hopkins on how to start a company as well as basic financing of different companies. So I have a very big passion for starting companies, entrepreneurs, small startups. So as we go through this, I'm going to go through different slides that I would recommend go into your decks. I've pitched well over 100 times for my current company, Morphix, as well as several other companies. I know a lot of what entrepreneurs go through, and it's not easy, and it takes a lot of work with a lot of times no reward. So hopefully by the end of this deck presentation, you may have some better insight on how to go after funding for your company. So first off, on your first slides, a big thing is to look professional, look like a legitimate company. You need like a very good looking logo. Don't do something in like paintbrush or sketch it on a piece of paper. That may sound trivial, but it happens all the time. Make sure you're a real company. If you waste investors' time and you're not even formed yet, and then you come back, they're not going to listen to you. Go through clean slide decks. Avoid those transitions a lot of people like to use. Just make it as professional looking as possible. So our first poll of the day is, I would like to know what industry you're from. You're some big, large biotech, academia, other types of biotechs, or startups. It'll help kind of gauge me as to, maybe giving you some additional insight if there's a bunch of startup people or a bunch of government people or academia, because I've been involved in licensing from all those different types of entities. Oh, wow. That's awesome. Hello, startups, my entrepreneurs. That's phenomenal. I think that there are something about 100 people in here, so that's great. So moving forward, one of the first slides you should have with your deck is your executive summary. What does your company do? So just an example, I'm in the cancer space, so I'll use cancer as my main example as we go through here. So, you want to be company A, that's your company name, develops treatments for cancers. You want to be kind of more specific than a treatment for cancer, because even if you go down to just breast cancer is, one of several, up to probably over 10 different types of sub-diseases. So it's good to be, broad, but specific at the same time. It's good to talk about the target that you're going after. A lot of times I'm in the immunotherapy space, and if you throw out an immunotherapy target, people will be all excited because they'll know what you're going after rather than figuring out what that is in some sort of mechanism slide down the road. So 5 slides from now, so that's good. And what you're doing to address that that particular marker. So if you're going after, cancer protein 1, are you a drug? Are you a small molecule? An antisense? Very briefly, these all should be very briefly from what it is. And then what's your commercialization plan? What target indication do you want to go through first? Why is that important? If you were to say something you shouldn't say is, I'm going after breast cancer, the 5-year survival in the majority of breast cancers is about 95+%. And it's a very broad indication to go after. You need to go after something like a triple negative breast cancer, which has a very low survival and there are few therapies on there. So you need to really, as briefly as possible, tell them, what's your company do? What's the target? and what type of indication you're actually going to go after. And this is applicable to diagnostics as well. The pathways are just a little bit different. And I'll try to remember to touch on those things as we go through this. Our next slide is the problem. Obviously, breast cancer is bad, but what exactly, like, what are you targeting? What protein is overexpressed on these cancer cells that you can go after? How does that protein actually, drive cancer cell growth, or do the opposite of that? You're trying to modulate it in a totally different direction. It's important to know your VC audience, because there'll be some experts in the room. There may be no experts in the room, and there may be the world's expert in the room. So oftentimes I like to be a very broad overview of the target we're going after, and not get too involved in mechanism. You will lose people in the beginning. You can always come back to those questions later on. You should also talk about how your technology is going to solve this problem. If your technology inhibits this certain pathway, talk about how it inhibits that pathway briefly, very, very high level at this point in time. Next, I'd like to go into what my technology is. Is it an antisense? Is it an antibody? Is it a small molecule? Again, some mechanism, not too involved in the science. On the left here, I'm just trying to show an example of this is Keytruda. It's an immune checkpoint inhibitor from one of the major pharmaceutical companies. And this is kind of the simplicity I'm looking for, is you have a tumor and you've got an immune cell, and Keytruda, the drug, binds to these specific receptors that then allow the tumor to be killed by the immune system. So, it's not super mechanistic, but you can get it in their heads of what your drug is actually doing. And there's multiple, and at least in this example, there's multiple different manufacturers making Keytruda. You want to briefly say, why is yours better than theirs? Is there a safety advantage? Is there an efficacy advantage? Is there both? Is there a modification to it that allows it to elicit more than one type of molecule? And one thing I see a lot is the bullet at the bottom: avoid, your drug can treat every disease or every cancer. People don't believe that, and it's generally never true. So don't say it. So as I said before, be specific in the indication. If there's a chance that your drug is applicable, we'll say not just that small subset of breast cancers, and it's applicable to all of breast cancers. You can bring that into the equation later on, but you need to be specific and focused on this, or you'll lose people. They will not believe you. So just things to keep in mind as you go through that. The next few slides are usually 2 to 5 slides of data supporting your drug in the particular indication. This is one of your big times to wow the investors. Some brief mechanisms you can go through if you have a gene knockdown, maybe a gene knockdown, but don't go through an entire signaling pathway of every single little detail in the signaling pathway. You will lose them. So important things like that protein that you're going after, or that that biomarker, show those data. If you are showing decreases in tumor growth, show that tumor was regressed in an animal model, or if you're into the clinic at some point, show that as well. You can keep those complex mechanistic slides at the end for backup slides. I'll go through some examples of backup slides that I've experienced for questions that will come up that you don't want during your main deck presentation. So it helps, it helps go through the data, and then you get to those questions as they come. So this is kind of an example of a survival curve that I would say is compelling. I think this is an esophageal Kaplan-Meier survival curve. One was treated with one treatment and one was not treated. You can see there's about a 20% difference in survival in these patients. So that's the kind of thing you really want to show, rather than nitty-gritty complex mechanistic slides. Sorry. Okay. And then once you get through all of your data slides, you should then get into your market size. As you briefly went over it in early slides earlier, and now that we see that you have X amount of deaths per year, what is the market for that overall indication? What's, you want the market for breast cancer, but you also want the market of that, that triple negative breast cancer you have in there. And it's another good thing to do is to throw in there, what are the competitors' drugs? How much did they make? So a leading drug for a triple negative breast cancer last year sold 8 billion, the revenues were $8 billion, and it only works in, we'll say, 5% of patients. If you believe you can work in 10% or 20% of patients, you can really, this is where you can really show the value from that particular indication. And I threw in just an example, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is an indication that I've gone after in the past. And this just goes to show on your left how the market for this is increasing. We also have potential 72,000 diagnosed every year, 22,000 deaths. The overall market's about $10 billion. I go into the, chemotherapy is a biggie for treating lymphomas. Rituximab is standard of care treatment. Was developed by Roche last year. I think it had revenues of about $8 billion. And you want to show that that indication is, your quickest way to market. If there's a bunch of competitors in that space, that might not be your quickest way to market. But when you do this analysis and you choose, what your market is, it's good to show that to your investors as you move forward. And there's also other mechanisms that you can use to get faster. There's fast track designation with the FDA. There's orphan drug status you can get if there's a certain amount of patients there every year. It's good to throw that in there because that can also help you determine how fast you can actually move this through the clinical trial rather than, a clinical trial, through clinical trials that last up to 10 years. Or you can do that in the same in 2 to 3 years with different types of designations. Next slide, and these orders can be changed depending on your current deck, but this is general order that I usually go through. The next is your clinical pathway. You need to show your investors how are you going to get to those data that show your drug works. Usually in small biotech, you could say commercialization, but it's really your value inflection point of what's going to say your drug works and some big company is going to come and buy you out or license the asset for you. How will you get there? What your phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials are going to look like. This is just an example over here on the right of a very common phase 1 clinical trial. It's a 3x3 dosing where there's different toxicity, different dose response toxicity. So you have a low dose, a medium dose, and a high dose. And will that trial get you some data? It will definitely get you safety, but is there a marker in there that can show you how you could move forward with your next set of clinical trials? Just for statistics out there, I believe, I could be wrong, I'm probably pretty close to right. In the past 10 years, I think there's only one company with a market cap of less than $300 million that's had a successful phase 3 clinical trial. So really getting through that phase 2 and getting to that point where you can show a big pharma company that it works is the point where they would then come in. So it's very important to design these and show to your investors how you're going to show them that your drug works. So to convince them that they're not going to be stuck in your company through a phase 3 clinical trial, they're going to be acquired, we'll say, in the end of phase 1 or phase 2, depending on how well things go. The next part is your funding ask. This is usually about 1 to 2 slides. You should really show them what your money is going to be, what their money is going to be used for. Remember, it's their money. They're taking all the risk. They want to know that you're not going to go blow it all in your giant salary now that you have your $25 million of, we'll say, Series A financing. So is this going to fund clinical trials? Is there more basic clinical research to go through? Is there some IND enabling studies, toxicity studies? Where exactly will that go? How long is it going to take? And what that money provides, will that get you to support additional fundraising rounds? Maybe not from 1 or 2 investors, but when you go to your Series B and you have a large syndicate with multiple people, they really want to know how that goes. It's oftentimes good to put a graph up. This is just a graph I threw in there. So this shows, I think this is about $15 million total. You have your total operating expenses. You need to make your drug for your IND studies. It's going to cost $500 grand. Your 1.5 million, we'll say, for IND enabling studies at at a CRO such as Charles River or Covance, just to name a couple. And then you need to make your clinical grade drug. You need time to ramp up that. And they, your VCs do this every day. They know what they're looking for, and they will know if you don't know what you're doing. So it's always good to keep that in mind. Next slide I'm going to go to is probably, as I say, one of the most important slides that they will get into. It's your intellectual property. What is your patent? What is the scope of it? Is it compositions of matter of a molecule that you've developed? Does it include methods? Hopefully it includes both. They tend to frown upon if you only have mechanisms of use or methods of use patents. So this is very big information that they were definitely going to be asking. Another thing is, where did your intellectual property come from? Did you license it? Different academic institutes aren't as good as others in terms of licensing, and they're kind of a pain. The same goes with the government. Different entities within the government have different, different reputations within the VC world. And then it also goes back to, is the IP yours, or did you develop it at a small lab and it's owned by you and 3 of your friends, or three partners? And how exactly is that? That's a transaction itself. How is that going to come out of all of this? And if you look up at a lot of oncology companies, I'm not going to name any, but you can see when they get through their phase 1 and phase 2, and big companies come into these and they're excited about the drug, they find out another company owns part of the drug, and then they have to buy them out for $1 billion just to get that part of the drug. So this is very important, and the smart VCs will ask those questions and do significant due diligence into your intellectual property. The next part's your team. I think some of what I'm saying in here also goes back to how you structure your company and who you put into your company, because that will also reflect on your presentation. Only include key people who are accessible to the company. People like big names a lot, or people think people like big names. But if you have for example, if you have the Nobel Prize winner for physics and you're running an oncology company for a small molecule, and you put him on your board, yay, he's the Nobel Prize winner for physics, but he basically contributes nothing to the company. So you really need to put the people who are key to success in those programs. People who have had previous R&D experience. We'll say, if you think of me in oncology and breast cancer, you need a breast cancer expert. If your drug is an antibody, you want an antibody expert. If your drug has an interest, if it's a very novel type of chemical, it's a new technology, you need to have the people that can push that through the IND and the early phase clinical trials for formulation and any potential talks, or even scale up manufacturing down the lines. If you just have any random person who has had experience in drug development, they're not going to have that particular expertise. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. Your VCs don't want to spend the money to reinvent the wheel. So it's best to have all those people in there. So just an example, me, the CEO of your company. I'm a former scientist at a big drug company. I'm a professor at big name schools. I've been CEO of other different companies, and I'm a key opinion leader in the immunotherapy space. That's a good person to have if you have immunotherapy going after a breast cancer. Bring on a chief scientific officer, someone who has previously had experience at another oncology company. And if they bring on people that have science and business backgrounds, is also very good for showing the VCs that you know what you're doing. And finally, there's your thank you slide. Might seem obvious, but it's not in many cases. Company logo, your information, and that's question time. And people will ask questions. They'll probably ask questions to the whole thing, but this is when you can come to your backup slides. If they haven't asked anything beforehand, you may go back to slides. And excuse me. Yeah, this is your time to get all those questions answered, and hopefully they will ask for an NDA and move forward. So that comes to our next our next poll. Just wondered if anyone has any idea what a typical phase 1 clinical trial in oncology goes for these days. Great. The answer, at least to the data that are out there, it's actually around $4 million for a typical phase 1 clinical trial. And the reason I put this in there is it's often difficult to for your budgeting for these VCs, but these are average clinical trial costs for a bunch of different indications: cardiovascular diseases, oncology, ophthalmology, respiratory diseases. You can see what obviously the costs go up as you go through different phases of clinical trials. But in a typical oncology, for a single indication, you have an average of $78 million. Not sure what the standard error is on that, but so when you're working on your budgets, you need to do research on that indication to really figure out what that trial will actually cost. Lots of academic institutes will give you deals on that. You can also acquire patients for a fee from different institutes. So it's something to look at when you're looking at recruiting patients for that phase 1 clinical trial. And your VCs will definitely be asking about those different things. A lot of people recently has asked, has COVID affected VC funding? It's been interesting watching the VC deals. In February, they were down about 50% in value and 90% by volume. That actually happened in China about a month beforehand, but it was really interesting though. There were so many deals that went by in March, or late February and March. So there's a huge surge of VC deals. More of them were focused on secondary financing, such as Series Bs. And as one may expect, there was a much higher launch of infectious diseases than in other types of areas, such as cancer, diabetes, and liver diseases. This is, I thought this would be useful to some of you if you're out looking for different VCs, but these are some of the major venture capitalists and their deal volume this year, I think up to the 8th of April, yeah. And RA Capital is a big one. Their total deal value is about $478 million, with 7 different deals. Alexandria, OrbiMed, yeah, these are all your top tier venture capitalists in the biotech space. And these are groups you would want to go after if you're trying to, get in touch with different venture capitalists. There's a website called pitchdeck.com that you can go to, and you can find pretty much every biotech VC that's out there. So expect to pitch 50 to 80 times before you get enough people interested to pull a deal together. So it's a rough world out there to be pitching to VCs, but that's how it is, and that's what you're in for if you haven't done it before. So now I'll go into some backup slides. These are things that I like to put in the back. These are things I've gotten just from experience, from what VCs ask me. Some VCs will ask super complex questions, so I've gotten to the point where I put the super complex slides in the back just in case. Sometimes they ask off the wall questions, and I still keep those in the back of my deck. So I usually have an unlimited, I probably have 30 slides in addition to the 20 I usually keep for a deck. You don't have to go through I usually don't go through any of them unless someone actually asks a question for them. When you're sending your deck to VCs, make sure you don't include those slides. Common mistake from lots of people. And think of, what investors are going to ask if you go to one VC, to keep notes in your head, or have, someone else who's with you keep notes of what they ask, so you can learn for the next time and you can get better and better. Other things that are important: detailed information of competition is something they often like to see. Mechanism of action, those complex mechanism slides I mentioned before that I said don't put in the beginning of your slide decks because you'll confuse people. This is where you can put those. If there's any important publications, obviously you can list them if you show data. Sometimes it's good to throw screenshots in there. Manufacturing information, if your drug's not typical of typical manufacturing, most VCs will know that and they'll ask those questions. And I'll show you comparable exits because in my space, it's a very hot space right now, and people like saying that all these immunotherapies are getting acquired for billions of dollars. So I'll just go through a few of these and my rationale behind doing them. This is a publication. An investor once asked me, can your drug get into solid tumors in humans? And the backbone of my drug has actually been shown to do that, even though at the time the drug was entering clinical trials. So this is the backbone of the drug, and this showed, obviously you don't have to read all of this, but this is something to prove to the investor that that type of drug can get into tumors. And that answered this question, and they're very impressed when you can answer those types of questions. This is a complex mechanism slide. It works on I work a lot with the CD47 immune checkpoint. And if I tried to explain this to you right now, I'd probably confuse everyone. And if you explain this to VCs who aren't familiar with their space, you confuse them. But if there's an expert in the room and they say, hey, what does CD47 interact with on the cellular surface? And you can say it. What's some downstream signaling below hydrogen sulfide? And you could say actin-tubulin. So yeah, that's a great slide to keep in the back, just in case anyone asks those types of questions. Within, we'll say my drug space for our triple negative breast cancer, it's good to throw this in the back. Where is your competition? This is just showing most of the competition is in the preclinical phase, where we've got a couple of these that are in later stage clinical trials. It kind of gives them the market landscape of what's out there. What are those other companies? If you are better than those companies, they'll probably go and look at those companies' data and say, hey, how does this differentiate from this entrepreneur who just pitched to me? In-depth timelines are good as well. We'll just say this is an example of we'll receive funding in April of 2018. What is exactly your progress, how you're going to move this to the clinic? This is a little more in depth from the timeline I showed you previously. It shows, when's your IRB is going to be submitted, when your license is going to be done, when your study is going to be done, when you're going to submit to the FDA. These are all things that they could ask you at any point in time, and it's good to show that you're thinking of these and what the current time frame would be. This is comparable exits. I mentioned that earlier. These are just companies that John's IPO'd for $1 million. Argonex went for 1.5 million. Hibrix was acquired by a very big pharma company by 500 million. These are immunotherapy companies, so it's good to show them that if they're not, there are biotech VCs that are very focused on oncology. There's some that are not focused on oncology, and they would be willing to get into oncology. So they wouldn't be as familiar with their space, but that's a slide to back them up if they ask, how big is immunotherapy at this point in time? So, other notes that I'll provide you from experience, confidential versus non-confidential. Most venture capitalists won't sign an NDA unless they're actually interested. Even if they are interested, they might not sign an NDA, so be careful. If you get an NDA request, this happened to me before during the deck presentation, in the middle of it, you should be proud of yourself, because I believe you probably impressed them. Be careful when you send your deck to VCs, even if it is non-confidential, because they will send it out to all their friend VCs, and there will be like a backdoor communication with them, and they will gang up on you to try to get more out of you. So be careful with that as well. Another thing I would say, be willing to give up control in some degree. If you're CEO now, if someone's going to give you $30 million, they might have an expert that you would be great for a VP of R&D or a great board seat, but they will likely, if they're giving you tens of millions of dollars, they'll want a board position. And so, yeah, be willing to give up some control, not everything, but it'll happen at some point in time. And it's good to keep your slides to about 20, more or less, 20 minutes. So you don't bore them, even if you have the coolest tech in the world. If you keep going on and on, you will bore them, and you don't want to lose their attention. So, and I am ready for questions if everyone has any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. Yes, we actually do have a few questions coming through the Q&A box, and we're still accepting questions, everyone, so please plug your questions in. We have about 20 plus minutes left remaining for Q&A. So the first one we're getting is, how valuable is it to use a professional graphic artist to make graphics? And then if so, if there's value to that, how do you find a biology-friendly artist?
Yes, I think there is value to that. You know, looking legit's very important. So I've known a lot of people that have been using, it's like crowdsourcing your logo, where you can, for a couple $100, send out your ideas for your logo to all these different graphic designers. I forget the name that we typically use, or that I've known a lot, but you can Google it. Yeah, and they usually send back different logos. Then if you like their particular logo, you end up paying them, and they tend to do very well with science. So I think it's a less expensive way, but you can really get your idea out to 1,000 different graphic designers that will do it in a, you know, in a way that's budget friendly for an emerging biotech.
Now you talk about just like a graphic design. Now, what about video? Is that valuable? Because I see, you know, nowadays there's a lot of, you know, like, you know, they do a video recreation. What are your thoughts about that?
If you can afford it, if you could, you know, if you show your immune cell killing a tumor cell, I think it's cool. I don't know how much value it would have, because I assume that's probably expensive. I know it's generally expensive. You know, if you're too flashy, they'll think you have money already, or they may think you're more focused on making your science look pretty. You know, getting into that data where you're showing tumors regressing by 40% is a lot more compelling than a video. But you know, I don't think it can really hurt unless you focus too much of your time on that.
Great. Another question. People really appreciate the information you provided in regards to the cost of clinical trials. Could you share what that would be for med device in addition to drugs?
That would be, you know, that's dependent, you know, that's dependent on what the type of, you know, device is. If you have, again, it's similar, it's somewhat similar to an oncology, or, you know, I mean, a rare disease. If there's not a lot of patients out there, it's going to be cheaper. I probably can't give you specific numbers at this point. I think our medical, when we ran our clinical trial, most of the patient samples we actually got for free through IRBs. So most of the costs in that, we're actually having the CRO analyze the sample with our assay. So in terms of patient recruitment, wasn't as bad. And you're also, you know, it's definitely cheaper. You're not treating patients. You're not caring for the patient after they're getting their new oncology drug. So it's definitely a lot cheaper. And that's, I always say the fun thing about my diagnostics experience is I'll get to see the fruits of my labor if it works within a few years, versus in oncology, it could be 10 years. It could be never. So it's definitely less expensive than your typical drug development pathway.
Right. So just to recap, everybody's putting some feedback in regards to that company you mentioned. They said the logo crowdsourcing is called 99designs.com.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay, perfect. Just so we can throw it out there. Now, question from Jay: what is the purpose of a pitch deck? Most people think it's to get investors, but is it really to grab their interest and get a second meeting? What are your insights
definitely
about that?
Yeah, it's definitely to obtain investor interest, get an investor meeting. It's to raise money, is the end goal. You know, we need tens of millions of dollars to move, at least in the drug world, to move our drugs forward. You can always go the grant route. At some point, your grant route's going to be maxed out by a few $1 million, unless you're extra lucky, and you really need, you know, $10 to $20 million to move it through the early stages clinical trial. You can also get partnerships with large pharma. That will also require a pitch deck. So yeah, the purpose of the pitch deck is to get money. You want to get interested in investors. You want that second meeting with them. You want the NDA, and you ultimately want them to give you the money. So.
Great. Now, what about mentioning risks and challenges in your deck?
I guess mainly because I'm in the oncology realm and most things fail. Most of the VCs know there's a high degree of risk. I think it's like 90% of drugs fail. So that's why they're there. And oncology is particularly risky because, I guess my response to that, at least in the oncology world, is show your benefits and show legitimate data that's better than everything out there. I don't know if I would go in and say, here's the risk of my technology. I think one, they should figure that out themselves, or they probably wouldn't be there. And two, that might kind of be downplaying how, as I say, how awesome you're supposed to make yourself look. Hope that helps.
Now, you talked about what people should do and not do. Now, if you can give, a startup, like 5 things you should not do when you're pitching, what would that be?
Oh, 5. I can give you one right now. In your intro, as I said, 20 minutes. In your intro, we're obviously all passionate here. Don't go off in a rant about how passionate you are and how, this is why you're all there. I recently witnessed this a few months ago where someone spent 40 minutes talking about where they came from. It was literally 40 minutes. So, get to the point, give the intro, get to the point. They don't want to be there forever. That's what you think. Don't talk about yourself too much. I think I just had one at the top of my head and I totally forgot what it was. As I said earlier, be willing to give up some control. That is a biggie too. It's a very biggie because they don't want to come in and have someone that they can't work with. And they'll probably get that off the bat. They'll figure that out. But if you go into it saying, I'm CEO, I invented this, I'm the only one who can be CEO, that's not going to work out well. Because I can promise you, if you're a scientist and you invented this drug, that's great, you're smart, but you don't know the business world, you don't know the regulatory world, you don't know the preclinical world that you need to get to the clinic. You're not a physician. If you are a physician, I've seen this before where the physician thinks they know everything. Obviously, the PhD thinks they know everything. It just doesn't work out well. And another thing I would say to do is don't get too emotionally involved in your technology. The failure rate is 90+%. So at some point, if it's not working, you're going to have to let go. And that's often a drain of money for a company. It's happened countless times, just publicly traded companies. You can see this happen over and over again of when you need to give up. Another don't, I would say, is don't, if you're an early stage company, don't go to a VC and say you have 5 drugs you want to move to the clinical trial. Even if you do have 5 different drugs for 5 different indications, focus on one and, use those as we've got development pathway down the road, if there is a failure, or, once we move this forward, we're going to have these other assets to move forward as well. So you're not necessarily a one-trick pony. So I don't know if that was 5, but it seems like 5.
Great, that's some really good advice. Thank you. Now, on the last slide, you said don't send a deck to VCs because they're going to share it and gang up on you for more information.
Yeah.
If you're not supposed to do this, what is the optimal engagement process to get a yes on funding?
I don't believe I meant don't send it. Did I say don't send it? I apologize if I said don't send it. I meant be careful. So if there's a company that is already invested in your target, they can use that to give to their current company that they're funding to give them an advantage. If you want to be careful about not giving out too much data, particularly for that, because you don't want to give your competition a one-up and you have some advantage that they could make their drug better. You don't want them to do that. And there's a happy medium between sending your deck to everyone. You have to send it out. Just, I don't, I've seen it happen. It's even happened to me. I guess find some way to find out who talks to who, or you might be able to know that while you're giving their deck. But it has been known for they will gang up, not necessarily in a bad way. Usually, if they gang up, you'll get funded. It just won't be as great of a value in the end for you. I hope that helps.
Yeah. So now, most folks are also applying for grant funding at the same time. Do you think a pitch deck is something that you should send to a program officer, at the NIH, if you're going after an SBIR? Does it help with the possibility of securing these grants?
I don't know about sending one to the program officer. I mean, I don't think it could hurt, but I will say I've written lots of SBIRs, and the commercialization plan within those very oftentimes mimics your commercialization plan in your pitch deck. I would say that the commercialization plan in your pitch deck should be a little more extensive for the SBIRs. But I think a pitch deck is a very good guide for those grants, because especially the SBIRs, they're basically like a 10,000 page pitch deck where you go through the indication, the target, the drug, you have to have your commercialization plan. So I think it's definitely a very good guide.
Great. Now, how do you recommend timing your funding rounds for the clinical translation pipeline?
That probably won't be up to you. That'll be up to the people who gave you your first round of funding. VCs, at this point, there are some that will do preclinical research. A lot of the ones, especially the ones that, everyone on that deck, that slide I sent you, usually likes things that are ready to go in the clinic. So maybe there's some IND studies ready to do, but they don't want to wait around for you to do drug discovery. Grants tend to be better for drug discovery. There are some VCs that will do drug discovery. You just have to find the right one. And that being said, there's different VCs that are going to be good for you and different VCs that are not going to be good for you. Some VCs will want to give you $100 million, take over the whole company, you get 1%, and you have no involvement. That might be fine for you. There's others that will give you a lower amount of money at a higher valuation, keep you involved. So you can usually look up online enough to figure out what type of VCs meant for you. There's also some other VCs, like I'm not sure if Third Rock was in that deck, but Third Rock, they don't typically fund companies. They fund an idea, a patent at an academic institute or a government institute. So they will actually form the company themselves. So there's also that route, and there's those types of VCs. So it's, you got to find the one that's good for you and fits the needs for your company as well as yourself, since it's you and the people giving you money.
Perfect. Now we have a Yelp resident joining us, and they're Damian Wheeler. Shout out to Translucence Biosystems. His question today is, do smaller scale investors, angel, pharma, care about the same things? Will they just get bored or maybe have a greater attention level? What are your thoughts about that?
I feel like the smaller ones are more invested than the bigger ones. They tend to have smaller portfolios, and they tend to throw one of their experts on the board to make sure things move along smoothly. It's kind of hit or miss. That's my opinion. The bigger ones are kind of the opposite. They'll throw money at it, put the right people on it, and hope it gets bought out. But there are big ones that care. There are small ones that care, and it goes both ways. But at least in my experience, the small ones seem to be, it's more of an intimate approach, and for them helping to move the company forward.
Great. Now, there's a question that wants you to elaborate a bit more on proposed pathway to commercialization, or value inflection point with respect to value.
Yeah, so I'll just use oncology because that's what I'm in, and it's a good example. So in oncology, they're usually smaller clinical trials. There's usually there's a death rate. It's not like you're treating pimples or acne. So you have to keep that in mind. So you can usually get through your initial safety studies pretty easily, but a lot of times in oncology, you can sometimes get a signal in a phase 1. So out of 20 patients, you can, if you have 10 to 20% responders, and the historical data say there's like 1%, that can sometimes be an indicator. You can also look at different biomarkers. If your drug goes after a particular biomarker and you see that biomarker is significantly reduced in those patient populations, that's an extra added potential value inflection point. Another thing, when I say historical, almost never do historical clinical trials of small clinical trials ever pan out in later clinical trials. So if what I just said, historic is 2, you've got 20 patients and you have a 10%, I'd say 99% of the time that won't show up in a phase 3 clinical trial. It's possible. And if you watch a lot of publicly traded small biotech companies, you'll see stocks go up 200% because of that, even though it doesn't really mean too much later on in powered. But if you can get a biomarker in there in that phase 1, then you can, that helps, helps prove that you're at a value inflection point. Another thing in terms of the phase 1, if it's a really hot immunotherapy target and it's highly differentiated than others and your preclinical data is awesome, a big pharma company could come around and acquire you. There's plenty of examples of them even acquiring companies in preclinical stage. In a more controlled phase 2 study, then you'll have things like overall survival, progression-free survival. And at the end of those trials, those things are, biggies. That's when a big pharma company would probably come in, most likely come in and take you out or support a massive Series B or Series C financing.
So now, as relevant, per COVID-19 environment, any thoughts about why respiratory system clinical trials are among, the most expensive?
I would assume that's, I'm not an expert in that, but I would just assume it's because they're all in the ICU, and the ICU is probably the most expensive place to be in the hospital. That's just my very uneducated, the quickest thing to pop in my head.
Great. Now, there's a question that we always get, at Yelp is, how do I actually get in touch with these venture capital groups? How do I, what's the best way to engage and get in touch with them?
One is to have a network. I know that's hard if you're a scientific founder. You can go to their websites and you can, use our contact form. But what I found best is going to the websites and finding the partner at the company who is in, we'll say, oncology and breast cancer, or just the oncology guy, and try to find his email address and email him directly. LinkedIn's good too. There's, you can try the email, you can go to LinkedIn and type in, you can hit connect and say, hey, I have an opportunity in oncology, you're interested. You're probably going to get out of 100, maybe 10 people respond. So don't be discouraged if that happens, because I can promise you that's probably what will happen. And another thing I do is I often present, or I go to the big oncology conferences like ASCO or AACR, and the VCs are all over the place there. When I've presented is probably the biggest time I've seen people come up to me. But a lot of the networking events they have and happy hours are put on by big funders and big pharma companies. And there's people there that's what they do. They're scouting for next tech. So, build your network, go to the conferences, and as I always say, annoy people through email on their websites, and you'll get some. And if you get one and they want to build a syndicate, they want more than one funder in it, they will call their friends and bring them in. So it's not just I got 5 out of 100. It can spiral out and you could get more.
Great. Now, so the question is, will VCs take control of my company after I get the funding?
So before you get the funding, you will negotiate your term sheet. And they obviously don't get their asset if you don't agree to their term sheet. But obviously you don't get your money if you don't agree to the term sheet. So, different VCs are different. You have to be reasonable. They're going to take a big chunk of the company, which, they're the one giving you $25 million. So you have to kind of give that up because you're not giving $25 million and you want this to move forward. You know it's going to cost way more than $25 million. So you just have to be reasonable. You can't think you're going to have 50% of the company in 5 years. After you've gone through $100 million in funding, you'll probably have 5 or 6%. But if that gets bought out for $5 billion, you're still going to have hundreds of millions of dollars to to spend. So be reasonable. Don't think you're going to control the whole thing forever.
Now,
that is if you want it to move forward.
How do you determine a good VC versus, the so-called vultures and evil ones out there?
You can, they have reputations that you can find online. Just Google it. I think another thing to do is when you get that term sheet, you'll know, because there'll be some negotiation beforehand. Some VCs have reputations. Just do your due diligence, look it up online. You just have to spend some time doing it. You can look at deals that have been done and how those worked out for those investors. So it all depends on what your priorities are and how good or how bad your tech is. If your tech is awesome versus mediocre, you'll get a much better deal if it's awesome versus mediocre.
Now, what's the number one indicator that my company is ready to go for VCs for capital? I mean, I'm sure there's lots of indicators. I mean, can you give us some?
I would say, whatever indication you're in, whether it be cancer or acne, make sure those data that you have, that preclinical data set, are awesome. And you need to be able to show that in comparison to what's out there is better in terms of an efficacy and safety advantage. Both of those are very important. You have to show that there's a market for it. It's pretty much basic business 101. Have the best product out there. Why is my product, what are the competitive advantages of my product versus the other projects? What's the market? If there's no other drug out there, then it may be way more ready to go to the market. Think of it as a VC. What's a VC looking for to move this to the market? They want something that, is one, going to make them a bunch of money, but they want the shortest pathway to making that bunch of money. So is that value inflection point in we'll just say oncology in a phase 1. You're not going to get a value inflection point in acne in a phase 1. It's just, it's not a deadly disease. There's a very long clinical pathway to that. Just if you look up the obesity drugs that are out there, those clinical pathways are so long. They're so expensive. None of those drugs really work anyways. So, they are frowned upon by a lot of VCs. So you need to have something that's exciting, something your data support moving forward, and something the VCs really want.
Great. Now, it's kind of assumed that is the first draft of the term sheet, drafted by the VC on their end, we're assuming?
Yeah, okay. Usually. Unless, you need it, if you get to that point, all right, I hope you already have an attorney, but you need to have a good attorney. It'll be worth it. But yeah, it'll usually come from them.
Perfect. So it looks like we were able to get through all the questions and we are on time. It's 1:57. So I wanted to thank you for joining us, Dr. Schwartz, and sharing your insight with us. Everybody wants you to have another one talking about negotiating with VCs. So we might need to maybe put that in the books. Yeah. But we have some upcoming, ScienceDocs webinars upcoming. You can check the ULP events page for the further dates. So in the meantime, if we can reach out, if we can assist in any way, please feel to reach out. You'll get a copy of this webinar. I think some people are requesting the slides too. Are you willing to provide the slides, a copy of the slides for us to share with the viewers? Perfect. Yeah. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Stay safe and stay healthy. And I think we have a break next week, but we'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.